I'm Harvard Business School professor Willy Shih. I study supply chains. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is Supply Chain Support. First question, an immortal kid asks, how do tariffs work? Well, tariffs are a surcharge that are applied on top of the cost of your import, right? So when you buy an import from some company abroad that's selling it to you, the US government, for example, would add what amounts to a tax on top of that value. So if you bought something that was worth $100 and you have a 25% tariff, then the US government would collect $25 from you in order for you to receive your package. The people who pay that tax are the people who buy the products, you and me, the consumers. At Michael Hughes 1. But seriously, y'all, what's with egg prices? First of all, we should recognize there are two different supply chains for chickens and eggs, right? Chicken meat is one supply chain, eggs are another supply chain. The hens that lay those eggs have suffered a lot from this avian bird flu, and that's led to the culling of a lot of those hens. When we cull all the egg-laying hens, the egg supply has gotten tight. That's why we've seen a huge increase in the price of eggs. So what we have to do is we have to rebuild the flock. There's another interesting aspect about chickens and hens. If you're an egg-laying hen, you need biotin in your chicken feed. And that biotin, by and large, comes from China. So if we get into a trade war with China and China decides that they maybe want to restrict exports of biotin, all of a sudden our hens are not going to be as productive laying eggs. That guy B. Mills asks, are we in a trade war? Yes, we're in a trade war, and it's getting worse. The purpose of a trade war is to favor your producers versus those of another country. The trade war really started with the first Trump administration by applying tariffs to China. The Biden administration also maintained a lot of those tariffs and added some tariffs and other trade restrictions. President Trump is imposing tariffs because he says, I want companies to make things in the United States. And by making imports more expensive, I'm going to encourage you to make stuff in the US. Maybe it'll be cheaper. The problem with the tariff argument is the cost of doing things in the United States is very high. Even today, when you look at the cost of labor in the United States versus the cost of labor in a place like Mexico or China, it's still 4 or 5 times more expensive to do something in the United States. What can you then make in the United States and be competitive? You can make things in the United States where you don't have a lot of labor content in your products. An example of that might be a jet engine, where there's significant labor costs, but as a percentage of the total value of the product, it's relatively lower. If I wanted to assemble an iPhone, the typical labor content would be probably about 4 hours. In China today, so say it's $6 an hour times 4 labor hours, that's $24. 4 hours of labor in the US, that'll probably cost me $40 an hour. Okay, so that would be maybe $160 versus $24 to assemble that phone. It's not going to happen. At Popeyes asks, hi, is Hal thinking, why the was toilet paper the first thing to go when this COVID hit? Okay, let's talk about toilet paper. There are 2 things to understand about toilet paper. Number 1, demand is flat. There's not like there's some seasons you use more toilet paper. The second thing to think about is economists say it's not very tradable. And what that means is it's kind of low value and it takes up a lot of space. If you ship a truckload of toilet paper, you're not making a lot of money doing that. And so you don't want to ship it long distances. It makes no sense, therefore, to import toilet paper from China, right? If you live in New York City, your toilet paper is going to be made somewhere in the Northeast or maybe mid-Atlantic states. It's not going to be made far away. I'm going to have factories that are loaded to 90 or 95% churning out toilet paper. So we're going to have a well-organized, very tight supply chain that doesn't have a lot of slack. Then when consumers go in and buy a lot, you're going to run out because there's not a lot of slack capacity to increase how much you can make when demand suddenly rises. I'll bring in some more machines, I'll ramp up, I'll run extra shifts, I'll delay my maintenance, okay, and they'll make more toilet paper. Eventually, people who've been stockpiling all that toilet paper don't have anywhere else they can store it. Once you get the 5-year supply, you know what? I think we have enough, and they'll stop buying it. Then sales will fall off a cliff. And you know what? That's exactly what happened. At Gukon asks, is the supply chain back to normal? Well, that depends. A lot of people would tell you the new normal is one where we constantly have surprises and disruptions. One example of a shock would be weather that causes port congestion. We remember during the pandemic where we had over 100 ships waiting to unload off the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. There's been big congestion off the ports of Shanghai and Ningbo in China. Another great example of the shock was when the Houthis started attacking ships that were going through the Red Sea to try to get across the Suez Canal. That caused a major shock to supply chains when shipping companies said, I can't use the Suez Canal anymore. At BS Viagra asks, how fragile is our supply chain when Houthi pirates can upend it and force us into battle? What the Houthis did is they occupied a strategic position on the strait that connects the Suez Canal with the Indian Ocean. That's the major trade lane from Asia to Europe. Historically, most of the shipments from China go through the Straits of Malacca, and they would go through the Suez Canal to Europe. But when the Houthis started attacking container ships in the Red Sea, that made the Suez unpassable for many of them. So then a lot of them had to sail all the way around Africa. That added maybe 10 or 12 days to the voyage. That also removed 12% of the global capacity of container ships just because they were occupied sailing around Africa. You may remember the movie Captain Phillips, where they looked at piracy off Somalia and the east coast of Africa. Anytime you have a major trade lane, it is susceptible to disruption just by these incidents like that. If you look at China, for example, they are paranoid that most of their oil has to flow through the Straits of Malacca between Indonesia and Malaysia right off of Singapore. They call that the Malacca dilemma. A lot of China's paranoia comes from they only have one coast. They feel hemmed in by this string of islands from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines. So when you study geography, you can see these choke points on major global trade lanes, all of which represent important vulnerabilities. From the Ask Historians subreddit, at what point in history did a global economy start to develop? Let's look at a timeline. Trade really began with the Romans, who were trading salt and other products. Remember, salary was money for salt. That was the original definition. The next big era was the Venetians. This is Marco Polo bringing back silk and ceramics from China across the Silk Road. We saw a real expansion of trade in the 1700s. This is when we had the sailing ships that would go around Africa to the Far East, or they would go to the Americas to bring back gold or trade in rum. And then we had a pause between World War I and World War II where there were a lot of tariff barriers and kind of a lot of inward looking. We saw post-World War II a big expansion in trade, and we saw this huge boom starting in the late 1990s, but really gathering pace in the time from 2001 until 2010. The movement of factories for things like textiles, clothing, consumer products, toys out of the United States into a low-cost region like China, where labor costs were often 1/20th of what they were in the US. In more recent times, starting in probably around 2016, we've seen beginnings of a trade war between the US and China. Companies starting to move production out of China, countries like the US applying tariffs to Chinese exports and then getting reciprocal tariffs applied to American exports. At GSW81 Donnie wants to know, why is the United States importing any food? The US has one of the best agricultural regions in the world. Now, it turns out, though, that a lot of food requires a lot of labor to harvest. For example, fresh fruits and vegetables. Let's take a crop like strawberries. We use a lot of labor on temporary immigrant visas, so-called H-2A visas, who can come in to California to pick strawberries. But when you're done with all the costs for that temporary labor, it costs you around $26.50 an hour to pick strawberries in California. Whereas if you wanted to pick them in Mexico, it's about $1.50 an hour. That's why it makes economic sense to import strawberries from Mexico. The same thing actually applies for things like apples, blueberries, tomatoes grown in Canada. It's actually cheaper to grow them in Ontario and ship them across. We are a large food exporting country. In fact, we are the largest food exporting country, but our food exports tend to be in commodities where you can have a lot of automation and you can have a lot of productivity. Think of things like corn, wheat, soybeans, where a farmer and a relatively small crew can run a very large farm and produce enormous quantities of these products without a lot of labor. @unormal asks, what causes supply chain issues? The problems come from disruptions. Disruptions may be caused by any kind of shortage in parts, or they may be caused by logistics issues, moving parts between various links. What had happened at the beginning of the pandemic was sales fell off a cliff for cars and trucks in North America. Many of the Detroit automakers canceled a lot of their parts orders, especially for microchips. Now, when demand picked up again, they went back to reorder those microchips, but meanwhile, the suppliers of microchips sold their capacity for other uses, like in appliances, in computers, and other things. So all of a sudden, the car makers couldn't get those microchips. When you're building a complex product like a pickup truck, if you're short one part, you don't get to finish the truck. If you look at a typical car or pickup truck, it may have a power steering assembly that comes from Mexico, or it may have castings that are used inside that come from India or China. A lot of products that we see, even though they are assembled in the US, have parts that come from all over the world. And that's what makes them complicated. This next question is from Quora. Which country has bigger ports, China or the US? The big ports are all on the east coast of China, and that's because the Chinese government, starting in the late 1990s and in 2000s, invested a lot in this infrastructure. They wanted to be efficient and make it easy for all of their manufacturers to ship goods abroad. And we're now seeing the consequences of that because these guys are huge and they're efficient. Number one is Shanghai. It's an amazing port. They built it on a man-made island out in the East China Sea, and they built a bridge to get all the way out there. You build an island out in the South China Sea because you want deep water, right? And they want to be able to handle the largest ships. So Shanghai is the largest. Ningbo, which is on the opposite side of Hangzhou Bay from Shanghai. And those serve the Yangtze River Delta, which is this huge manufacturing hub. You have thousands of companies, literally, who package up their goods in containers and they take them to those ports. I visited the port in Shenzhen a couple of years ago, and I asked them, it's like, how many trucks a day do you handle? And they said, oh, we usually get 20,000 trucks a day. Imagine 20,000 trucks going to the port of Newark, New Jersey. That would be like backing up from Newark to Philadelphia. By the way, I asked the guys in China, it's like, what's your worst traffic jam you ever had? It's like, 20 kilometers long. The U.S., our total imports across all ports and across the borders bring in between 90 and 100,000 containers a day. That's across the whole country. A typical port complex in the U.S. has a handful of slips for docking large ships. It may have as few as two, it may have a half a dozen. In Shenzhen, they probably have close to 20 slips for handling these ultra-large ships. The largest port complex in America is the Los Angeles Long Beach complex. If we had congestion around Los Angeles Long Beach, some of them will go up to Prince Rupert in Canada. When you look at the time it takes to transit from Japan, it's about 2 days sooner than it takes to get down to Los Angeles or Long Beach. From Prince Rupert, and then we have Port of Oakland, which is actually a major export port for products from the Central Valley, things like almonds. Next question, Stiletto Princess asks, why does Trump want the Panama Canal in Greenland? A lot of that is because these oversee critical sea lanes. In the case of the Panama Canal, obviously connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic on the shortcut through Central America. Greenland is becoming more important as people look at the warming Arctic. People are already experimenting with shipping goods from China to Europe through the Arctic because they can do it. We don't have ice all year anymore. Greenland, even though it's mostly covered by ice, has a wealth of minerals that are important, things like rare earth elements. So he thinks maybe he wants to have access to those. We talk about lithium for batteries a lot. a lot of that lithium comes from places like Chile in South America. They bring it to China and then they refine it. They control the refining capacity for rare earths. So what was, until the mid-1980s, the world's largest rare earth mine is actually in Mountain Pass, California. But since China invested in that refining capacity, a lot of those rare earths have been going to China for processing, and then China sells it to the rest of the world. Our next question is from Upbeat Mastodon 223. Is supply chain management just basically coordinating supplies from one place to another by communication, or is it more than that? Supply chain management is all about matching supply with demand. In other words, customers want to buy stuff, and I want to make sure that all the steps I need, everywhere from production to shipping it around, is in place to meet that need. If you work in supply chains, you have to worry about your supplier network. Where are all the components and all the parts that you use to make your product going to come from? How are they going to get there? How many do I want to have on hand when I'm assembling them? All those things you have to figure out when you look at the customer demand. Some products have different kind of demand profiles, right? A lot of them have a big back to school season. A lot of them sell a lot of their products between October and end of December for the holiday season. If you're in the supply chain for candy, you have to figure out how I'm going to prepare for this huge spike of demand in the 3 weeks before Halloween, when most of the candy in the country is sold. That's the type of job a supply chain professional has to deal with. At Be Like Wes asks, bro, how does KFC run out of chicken? Great illustration of supply chain resilience, because back a couple of years ago, KFC in the UK changed their distribution network. They shifted over to DHL as their distributor, who had one warehouse for distributing all their chicken to their stores. One day there was a string of huge traffic accidents around that warehouse, which prevented any trucks from getting out. So they couldn't get any of their chicken out to their stores. And so you have KFC hanging signs in their windows, sorry, no chicken. This is a classic example of the trade-off of resilience versus cost in a supply chain. They only went down to one warehouse, which is less expensive, but it's less resilient. 5 warehouses meant you take one out, the other 4 can still go. At Christian Suji says, imagine having one of the busiest canals for shipping in the whole world, but you deadass never expanded the one cargo ship-wide part of the canal. Like, what do you expect? Whole global supply chain obviously will grind to a halt. I think Christian is talking about an incident in the Suez Canal during the pandemic. That was when the Ever Given was trying to go through the canal during high wind conditions, and it got stuck sideways and it blocked the canal. You say, well, how could one ship block the canal? Well, this ship is 400 meters long, longer than a football field. Remember, a lot of this infrastructure was built a long time ago before we had some of these mega ships. For example, the Panama Canal was built at the beginning of the 20th century, before we even had container ships. The first container ships only held like 50 containers at a time. These days, the biggest ships hold 24,000 containers, and they are 400 meters long, which is a lot longer than a football field. So the ships have gotten bigger because they're more efficient and you can move more stuff at a lower cost. And the infrastructure hasn't kept up. At Thomas Testia, how about the broken supply chain and food processing industry crippled by Trump's elimination of 2 million legal immigrant visas? That's a big problem, because a lot of jobs in fruit and vegetable harvesting as well as food processing are jobs that, frankly, American citizens don't want. In the state of California, for example, half the agricultural workforce is undocumented illegals. So if we deport those, then the question is going to be, who's going to pick those fruits and vegetables? We see undocumented workers as well in a lot of dairy plants, a lot of food processing plants, meat processing. So we're highly dependent on immigrants, many of them undocumented. Jabe Thomas, Republican, asks, how could the U.S. bring back manufacturing and industry? What we can do is we have to focus on industries where either we don't have a lot of labor content in those products, or areas where we can win on the basis of productivity. If you're going to have high labor costs, that labor has to have high productivity. The way you do that is with automation, with new designs. It's a tough problem because as we move production offshore, let's say furniture manufacturer, which really left North Carolina, those people moved on to other jobs. So now if you want to bring production back, you've got to train people how to make furniture again. It would take time and it would take money. One of the other things that we have to recognize is when we offshored production, that means we took a factory and we moved it to China. When we moved it to China, you had to build the building, hire the workers, hire the management, train people, bring in suppliers. What paid for all of that was lower product cost. Typically, the amount you would save would pay for itself within a year, or sometimes even less. That was moving from a high-cost country to a low-cost country. Now, if you want to move from a low-cost country to a high-cost country, what's going to pay for it? Because you're not going to save anything, but you still have to build the factory. You still have to hire the workers. You still have to train the workforce, and your product is going to cost more. So it's a very difficult problem. Next question. I'm sitting here in my leather recliner, wondering how all the individual parts came together to deliver this level of chill for me? That's a great question because I visited one of these leather recliner factories in China, and it in itself is a great story of globalization. They got their leather from the United States. They bought their lumber to make the frames from Argentina, and they bought the chemical foam that they used to line the chair from the Netherlands. So all those parts came together in this factory in Shenzhen. That factory had a warehouse that had 500,000 cowhides that they were using to make recliners, and they would fill about 160 shipping containers a day stuffed full of leather recliners. Then they'd send them down to the port. Historically, a lot of Asian goods would come from Los Angeles and Long Beach and come to rail hubs like Chicago or Kansas City or Dallas. Now, Chicago is a major hub for containers that come from Asia and are going to be distributed across the Midwest. Trucks that will serve as far east as Ohio and sometimes maybe even New York. Increasingly, what we're seeing is traffic coming through the Panama Canal and going to Gulf ports like Houston and then coming north out of Houston to serve the middle of the country. Then they would go into a distribution center. And from the distribution center, they might go to a furniture showroom, or they might go to a local warehouse outside of the city. So when you order that recliner, that last mile delivery to your house would be from that last warehouse. At Larissa Ariri asks, how is Temu so cheap? Two things to remember about Temu. Number one is Temu and Shein don't have their own factories. They are actually pure supply chain companies because what they do is they match demand from you with suppliers in China who then send the product directly to you. The other way they can be cheap is there's this exception to the import regulations that's called the de minimis exemption. Most Shein and Temu products come in under the de minimis exemption. Anything under $800 doesn't have to file customs paperwork. Just to give you a scale, de minimis exemption packages are coming in at the rate between 3 and 4 million packages a day. And that means 3 to 4 million packages a day that come in without having to do any customs inspection or filing any paperwork. What these guys have discovered is our products are light enough and the cost is low enough that we could ship it by air cargo. If you look at like the last few months of 2024, these de minimis shipments from companies like Temu and Shein were about half of the air cargo traffic across the North Pacific and half the air cargo traffic from China to Europe. At Conflicted Art wants to know, I just wanted to go to sleep last night, and instead I laid there awake for hours thinking, how is there another GPU shortage? First of all, we have a huge spike in demand for GPUs. That stands for graphic processing units, a computer chip that is used in AI applications. Those GPUs, by and large, are manufactured by one manufacturer in Taiwan. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing, also known as TSMC, owns about 95% of the capacity in the world. The reason we're short is it takes a while to ramp up that most sophisticated capacity. The factory to make these GPUs right now. They start at about $20 billion to build one of those factories, and it takes about 2 years to build and equip one of those factories. Those factories also make chips for iPhones, personal computers, the servers that go into the cloud data centers at Amazon and Facebook and other places. So there's a lot of demand for those chips, and there's relatively little supply. And mostly what we're seeing here is a demand spike. Our next question is from Automatic Cold Days. Is there any way of knowing how many shipping containers are in the world? I would guess there are hundreds of millions of shipping containers out there. Now, what happens is shipping containers are mostly made in China because steel is cheaper in China, and shipping containers are pretty much all steel. Most of them come out of China to the US, to Europe, and they're filled with goods. We don't have nearly enough stuff to put in them to send them back. So a lot of empty containers end up hanging around. The container lines all sometimes had ships to pick up all those empties, but we tend to have a huge imbalance on empties and full containers, right? We'd have a lot of yards clogged with empty containers waiting to go back. At Douglas Lumsden 1 asks, I'm debating whether to buy a few of these 8-foot wide, 49-foot long, 9.5-foot tall steel shipping containers. How expensive could they be? It's probably around $1,000. The shipping lines all sell their containers after a certain number of years, and a lot of people use them for storage and other purposes. I guess you could buy one. I once thought about converting one into an apartment, so anytime I wanted to move, I could call a shipping company and say, hey, move this to Hong Kong, and then I'd have my house ready, but I never did that. For context, there are different sized containers, right? There's some that are 20 feet long, some are 40, some are 53.5 feet long. Basically, it's just a steel box. So if you have a good use for steel boxes, I guess you could do it. There will never be a shortage of used shipping containers. At Benpo234 asks, WTF do rare earth metals have to do with my wait time for my RAV4 Prime? Rare earth metals show up in a lot of crazy places. So for example, efficient motors have this rare earth called neodymium. And neodymium is what you use to make magnets. Most of that comes from China, by the way. And in those batteries, now you have metals like lithium and cobalt and other metals which are really controlled by China in that supply chain. At Preston Brooks SC says, you all bought a damn candy bar at a gas station recently? A regular sized Snickers bar is over $3. What? Has the supply chain of creamy nougat or crunchy peanuts been severely compromised by COVID or something? Let's talk about the chocolate supply chain. A lot of it comes from the Ivory Coast in Africa, and because of weather, the cocoa crop this year was really bad. So the cost of cocoa went way up, and that's why your Snickers bar is more expensive. Peanuts are okay. No new news on peanuts. At Chucky Stomper 69 asks, wait. Forget the oil and steel and aluminum lumber. If the U.S. slaps us with tariffs, where the are they going to get potash? Potash is a fertilizer that is used by farmers around the world, across the United States, and we get it all from Canada. So he's right. If we put tariffs on Canada and they retaliate by restricting potash, that will hurt us, but it will also hurt the Canadian exporters of potash. We also get a lot of oil and steel and aluminum from Canada. One reason aluminum is cheaper to produce in Canada is because they have a lot of hydropower. We get oil from Canada, primarily the tar sands, the Athabasca tar sands in Alberta. And we have refineries in the US that are very well geared to that type of refining. Different oils, depending on where they are pulled out of the ground, have a different chemical composition. And depending on that composition, refineries have to be geared to that particular composition. So US Gulf Coast refineries are geared to refining the type of crude that comes out of Canada. And Eric Oden asks, what is better alternative to JIT, just-in-time inventory? Because clearly that's not working anymore. Toyota came up with just-in-time after World War II when they didn't have a lot of resources. Okay, and the idea was, don't feed me anything until I need it, but feed it to me exactly when I need it. Toyota learned a lot during the 2011 East Japan tsunami and earthquake when one factory that was producing 45% of the world's engine microcontrollers shut down, and it shut down Toyota's production. And they then realized at the time, they said, hey, wait a minute, our semiconductors come from geologically and geopolitically unstable parts of the world. So what we really need to do is we need to think in terms of lead time. I'm going to hold an inventory that reflects what's the lead time I would need to replace it if I had a sudden interruption. So going into the pandemic, you might have noticed Toyota kept producing cars almost a year longer than many of their competitors because they had brought in a lot of inventory. So just in time plus lead time is a better way to look at this. Internal Early 5885 asks, will global supply chains collapse in a few years, or is that doomerism? I think that's a little pessimistic because we are a very interdependent world. I think we're moving to a world of more regionalized production. We may get to a kind of aligned block, Americas and Europe and Japan and Korea versus China. But I think we are so dependent on getting things from other parts of the world, we can't do it all ourselves anymore. So I don't think it's going to be collapse, but they're going to look different. Those are all the questions for today. Thank you for watching.